We are now going to move on to looking at classical Greek architecture. So we've been looking at the Archaic period. We looked at the development of the style called the Doric, which is, well, you're looking at a Doric temple. The characteristics of the Doric are these sort of plain capital with a sort of saucer-shaped top, this saucer-shaped capital on top of a fluted column. The shaft itself is fluted. The style of the temple is what we call a peripteral temple, which means that there is a colonnade, a row of columns all along the periphery of the temple, so hence its name, peripteral. The main difference between classical and archaic temples are the proportions. Classical temples tend to be a lot longer and leaner looking. There is more of an emphasis on elegance. As always, the Greeks are obsessed with proportion. They related proportion to perfection. And the Greeks were always sort of on this quest for perfection, because that is in many ways what humanism is about. This idea that we have a sort of moral obligation to the gods to make ourselves better, because we were given this incredible gift of being human, and if we don't improve ourselves, if we don't become moral, then we have failed. And remember also, there's this close tie between beauty and goodness in Greek philosophy. So things that are beautiful, things that are perfect, are also good. And that's an important thing. There's this sort of underlying morality under all sort of, Greek concepts. Okay. We are looking at really the first great temple of the classical period. Now, what makes the classical? A lot of it has to do with Greeks' position in the world. The Greeks in the 5th century win a decisive victory against the Persian army. I'm going to talk about this in depth in just a little bit. But this put sort of the Greeks culturally, in terms of their ability to defend themselves, in terms of their sort of status in the Mediterranean world, it elevates them. And at the same time, the Greeks see themselves as sort of separate from everybody else who is around them. The Greeks see themselves in a way as inherently better. They refer to those who aren't Greek as barbarians. This term really comes from the fact that they couldn't understand their language, but there was sort of a kind of a snobbery among the Greeks. If the Greeks believe that man is the measure of all things, they believed that Greeks are the measure of all men. And then each city-state would kind of believe that they were the measure of all Greeks. But there is certainly a quest for betterment. And the Greeks believed they had kind of achieved this sort of greatness because of their victory over the Persians. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. So this is this is the first great sort of temple of and work of architecture of the classical era. It's called the Temple of Zeus. It is located in Olympia, Greece. It was built for the Olympic Games. The Olympic Games were a competition, as you know, an athletic competition, where the Greek city-states, and at this point they had been doing it for around 300 years, where the Greek city-states would meet together and they would have these athletic competitions. Now, and they would also have there was also a musical competition. These weren't just to sort of prove who is the best and who could have bragging rights, though. These were part of a religious festival dedicated to Zeus and the other Olympian gods. And so there was a religious aspect, there was a moral aspect, there's that word again, to these games. Because the Greeks are all about proving your worth, proving your goodness, proving your ability to improve yourselves. And what better way to do this than through a contest? A contest is meant to are designed so we can prove who we are as people, and that we have put in the hard work and we have put in the dedication, and we show a sense of character proving who we are. And so the winner is rewarded for their hard work. Do you see a theme here? I hope you do. So this temple, like all Greek temples, was painted. It is, as I said, a Doric temple. It has images of stories relating to, of course, the Olympic gods. But all of the stories on this temple tell a moral story. Really quickly before I move on, like all Greek temples, there would have been a statue inside depicting the god who the temple is dedicated to. And in this case, we have Zeus. These were massive sculptures. They, as the one here of Zeus, was clothed in golden garments. But remember, these statues would have been thought to be the actual god themselves, that these were sort of vessels where the gods would come down and occupy them on earth. So this isn't just extravagance for extravagance sake. This is in many ways the body of a god. In some ways, the way the Ka statues in ancient Egypt were sort of the body of the pharaoh after death. But let's take a look at what's going on around or in the sculpture of the temple. I'm showing you here a temple called Hera II. That's actually in a place called Paestum, Italy. We saw its neighbor Hera I when we looked at the archaic, but this gives you an idea of what the Temple of Zeus looked like. The Temple of Zeus is no longer. It's been destroyed, but we have this Temple of Hera II, which would have been a very similar temple in a very similar style. The pediments, and remember the pediments are the triangular areas, they are the triangular areas above the, or at the ends of the temple, sort of following the roof line. And this is a major area for sculpture. So let's look at the sculpture that we would have found in the Temple of Zeus. This is from the East Pediment. This tells the story of a king named Onimaus, who heard a prophecy that he would die if his daughter married. And any suitor who challenged the king in the chariot race could win her hand in marriage. But if the suitor lost, then he was killed. So basically, the king had this sort of magical horse given to him by the gods. And so there was no way that anybody could win this race against the king. But this guy, Pelops, bribed the keeper of the king's horses, the king's groom, Myrtilos, to rig the race. The king was killed, and Pelops wins. But then, instead of paying his debt, Pelops drowns the Myrtilos. He drowns the groom. And because of this, a curse is put on Pelops and his descendants, which leads to generations of tragedy. And this was written in a play that you might have had to read for your English classes, or a series of 3 plays, the Erechtheion saga by the Greek playwright Aeschylus. But what's important here is that we are given an image of morality. What Pelops did is morally wrong on several different levels here. He cheats, he bribes, and he murders. And because of that, his family is cursed. So here's this whole concept again of Greek morality and relating to the idea of goodness. And this sort of quest this desire for goodness. And so yes, this is an image of a race, of a sporting event. So here we are at the Olympics, the main temple at the Olympics, and yeah, of course, there is an image of a contest, which fits right in with the Olympics. But also there's this idea of morality. There's this idea of good and evil, and those who are immoral will ultimately suffer for their immorality. On the other side is an image of the gods battling the centaurs, something called the Centauromachi. This is basically another moral story about the good gods battling the immoral centaurs. It's a long story. You're not going to be quizzed on it. But we have this other image of sort of morality. We have a rare image in the Temple of Zeus at Olympia of old bodies. Typically the Greeks, as you know by now, if beauty equals goodness, then they were sort of obsessed with the young male body. For them, this was sort of the pinnacle of the human form, and it is rare in the classical era to see, well, things like this, an old man. But this is a seer. A seer is a person who can see the future, and this guy sees what is going to happen to Pelops. He sees what is going to happen to the king. He's the guy who tells the king that he's going to be killed, and he has a sort of look of horror on his face. But I'm pointing this out because it is rare to see the images, the depiction of older bodies in the classical era, where everything is sort of about beauty and goodness and morality. Here's yet another image. This is of Apollo. This is from the West Pediment. But once again, this sort of highlight of the powerful male nude body, which for the Greeks was the sort of pinnacle of everything. The other image, though, I really want to focus on from the Temple of Zeus is this image of Heracles, or you might know him as Hercules, which is the Roman version of his name. Heracles was the daughter of Zeus, or was the son of Zeus. He was not the daughter of Zeus, he was the son of Zeus. And Zeus's wife, Hera, was incredibly jealous because Zeus was constantly having affairs and sleeping with people and having half-human offspring. And this made Hera angry, and she was constantly seeking revenge against the offspring of Zeus. And this is no different with Heracles. She makes him crazy. She literally makes Heracles go mad. And in a fit of rage, Heracles kills his family, murders his wife and children. That is not in the Disney movie. But of course he feels bad for this. He's done this horrible, unforgivable thing. But he wants to redeem himself. And so the gods say, look, if you go to this king, Eurystheus, if you go to, so they say to him, if you go to this king Eurystheus, he will give you a series of labors, and by performing these labors, you will redeem yourself. They were initially 10 labors, but because he had help and got payment for 2 of them, then they bumped the number up to 12. The last labor was to rescue these golden apples, or to take these golden apples, not rescue them, from the Hesperides. They're these sort of magical apples. The old Titan Atlas, who held up the world on his shoulder, was the only person who can go and get these. So Heracles goes to him and says, look, I tell you what, I'll hold up the sky while you go get the apples. Atlas is going to trick Heracles, once again, the concept of morality, or immorality in this case, and let him keep holding up the sky, but Heracles tricks Atlas back into holding up the sky, and then he runs away. You see on the left is Athena, who was Heracles' sort of patron goddess. She's the goddess of wisdom. She is also a warrior goddess, and she helped him through these labors and guided him. And so you can see her sort of acting almost as sort of like a guardian angel sort of figure over here. So once again, we have this idea of morality. Heracles, even though it's not his fault, does this terrible thing. He murders his family. But because he is a moral man, he seeks redemption. Even though he could easily claim, well, I was out of my head, literally, and somebody forced me to do this, he doesn't. Because of his morality, he quests to rectify the wrong. And so this all ties into this concept of the temple of Zeus at Olympia, where one went to go prove their mettle, where one went to go prove themselves as a moral person, where one went to this religious festival to honor the Greek gods. So we're continuing on discussing the classical era of ancient Greece. And as you guys know, the classical era is a period of a tremendous change. It is a period where Greece reaches a level of power and influence that it had not experienced before, thanks to you very much to the Persian Wars and their victory over the Persian Empire. And we saw the effects of this, especially on architecture, and also to the sculpture related to that architecture. We saw this in sort of more sort of realistic sculptures. We saw this in the use of narrative stories to help tell a moral. And because what we are looking at is the effects of also humanism, right? This idea that human beings are awesome, and that what our artists are trying to do is they're trying to portray human beings as realistically as possible, because they want to sort of honor the human body, and they're also portraying the human body as sort of physically fit and mentally fit as possible, because of this idea, once again, this humanist idea that being human is a gift. And the one thing that sort of separates us from, well, every other creature on the planet is the fact that we can improve ourselves. And so for the Greeks, this concept of self-improvement is not just there for its own sake. It's not just to make you a better person, but there's a moral imperative behind it. We have to be better because the gods have given us the ability to become better, both in mind and body, and if you improve both of those, you become better morally, right? And so what I want to look at now is freestanding sculpture, not sculpture associated specifically with a temple or associated as the facade or the decoration on a temple, but instead sculpture that could either be found inside of it or in other places, forums, markets, social or political buildings, etc., etc. So let's take a look at a statue called the Critios boy. And this, in many ways, is, well, in every way, this is the sort of ground zero point of classical sculpture. This is sort of separates what came before with the archaic and the classical itself. And with classical art, we get art that is much more realistic, that often shows human emotion and human intelligence, and we see the artist really start to perfect their command of human anatomy. And so Critios boy is the earliest example of something we call Contrapposto. So take a look on the right, and you will see a typical chorus figure. You guys are used to these by now. You know what a chorus figure is. You know they were this sort of general usage kind of statue. Chorus means boy. They were used as grave markers. They were used as memorials, etc., etc. And they represent the sort of great, what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of the tremendous strides gained during the archaic period, where Greek artists really began to master the human body. But there are still some factors in this sculpture that keeps it from looking completely realistic. And those, of course, are the stance, this very stiff stance with the Egyptian hokey pokey, that left leg sticking out, that is completely unrealistic. So it lacks any sort of feeling of real motion or movement. It's just sort of standing there in this very stiff sort of way. We also talked about the kind of generic way that some of the muscles are portrayed. So, the abs are just kind of this generic sort of grid. The knees are just this kind of generic sort of knee. They're not individualized. How do you individualize a knee? Anyway, so... and of course, we have that archaic smile, that archaic face. But here we have something completely different. We have a very realistic face. Gone is that archaic smile. Also gone are his eyes. But he would have actually had eyes. They would have been inlaid with seashell or ivory, some sort of substance. There's lots of different materials that could have been used. Bone is another one, but we don't really know they're gone. This was found at the Acropolis, so it had suffered some damage, obviously. We call it Critios boy because for many years scholars thought a sculptor named Critios made it, but then that has been debunked, and now we're not really quite sure who made it, but we still call it Critios boy because that's the way the world works. Human beings are lazy, and we're not going to change the name if we damn well know it already. Okay, so we have a boy, a young man, sort of the Greek ideal. Remember, the Greeks were like, human beings are awesome, but male human beings are the most often awesome. And sort of young, vibrant men in their late teens and 20s are super awesome. They are the sort of ideal of the gods. And so we have this, in many ways, a kind of a version of a chorus figure, but there's some differences. Gone is that stiff stance with the left foot sticking out. Instead, what we have is a kind of relaxed position. And if you look at his body, you'll notice that there's a slight bend to his spine, and one hip is slightly higher than the other, and there's a kind of a shift. This is known as the Contrapposto. Contrapposto literally means counterbalance. But the Greeks started to introduce this into their sculpture because it's more realistic, and realism is one of the goals of the Greeks, so they can show off their command of the human body and show off how a human body really looks. It's also more realistic in terms of the way our behavior. You never, like, if you walked into a group of people, you would never see them standing like a traditional chorus figure. If you did, they were probably actually doing the hokey pokey. But what you normally see are people kind of standing, distributing our weight unevenly on one side or the other, creating a contrapposto. And the Greeks really were the first to introduce this because it creates this feeling of realism, it creates a feeling of livelihood, it creates a feeling of motion, it creates a feeling of life, right? And so for the first time we have an incredibly realistic sculpture on every aspect, in terms of the anatomy, in terms of the emotion, in terms of the movement. Everything about this is realistic. But this being the Greeks, it is sort of an ideal realism, isn't it? It's a perfection, because the Greeks were always, you got to be the best that you can be. Years ago, when I was a little kid, there was a commercial for the army that was "Be all that you can be," and this is sort of the Greek motto, if you want to think of it that way. Be all you can be the best, be this perfect. And here we have this Critios boy. But if you look at his face, while I say there's emotion, and there's still not a lot going on. This is not a brilliant young man. This is a good-looking young man, but not necessarily maybe the sharpest tack in the box. You know what I'm saying? In the early classical, we often see these kind of models, types that aren't necessarily represent this concept of sort of deep intelligence. But we're going to see that change, well, right now. If you look at Critios boy, he was made around 480 BCE. So this is right around the time of basically the end of the Persian Wars. This is very, very early in the classical era. If we look at this sculpture, or these sculptures, there's two of them. These were made later. These, are 20 to 30 years after Critios boy. And boy oh boy is there a huge difference. So first of all, Critios boy is made in marble. These are made in bronze. And the Greeks actually preferred bronze sculptures because they're much stronger. They are more durable. You can actually do more elaborate poses with bronze because they are very strong. And you don't have to worry as much about pieces breaking off. Like in Critios boy, he has no arms. He's missing part of a leg. Because marble is very fragile. However, bronze is very, very strong stuff. It's also a lot more expensive than marble. And the Greeks actually preferred bronze. And from all accounts, the Greeks actually made a lot more bronzes than they did marble. They usually used marble exclusively on their buildings, on the decoration of the facades, the fronts and sides of their buildings, because, the buildings were made out of marble. But they used typically bronze for their freestanding sculptures because of the reasons I said earlier. Okay. How come we don't have a lot of these bronzes, though? We don't have very many left at all. And the reason is because bronze usually gets melted down over time. Because bronze can be used to make things like weapons and building materials and other kinds of sort of utilitarian kinds of objects. So usually once a society sort of falls apart, usually whatever culture takes over where that previous society was, usually one of the first things they do is they melt all the bronze sculptures so they can make useful stuff out of them. So these bronzes, though, survived, and they survived kind of miraculously due to a shipwreck. Both of these bronzes, which are known as the Riace Warriors, Warrior A and Warrior B, were found off the coast of a town in Italy called Riace, where these were being shipped to from Greece. And around the year 2500, or around the year 450 BC, around 2500 years ago or so, the ship wrecked, and these sculptures fell to the bottom. In the early 1970s, I can't remember, 71, 72, somewhere around there, a man was swimming outside of off the coast of Riace. He was on vacation and he was swimming. And I've heard accounts that some say that he was scuba diving with gear. I've read other accounts that say he was free diving. Doesn't really matter. But what matters is that he's swimming along the ocean floor and he saw a hand sticking up from the ground. Okay, so if I saw a hand sticking from the ground, I would be running on the water back to the beach, freaking out. But that's not what this guy did. He kept digging and digging and digging and digging and digging, and he discovered not one but two complete Greek bronzes. Pretty amazing. And these bronzes are very rare because, as I said, most Greek bronzes survived. But they also give us an example of how the classical era developed over time, because if you look at them, compare them to Critios boy, you can see several things. First of all, Critios boy is a boy. He is, or a teenager, right? He's a youth. But these are men. And as we move through Greek classical culture, the ideal sort of man grows up, and he goes from being sort of a young, kind of good-looking dude to a strong, muscular, powerful man. Just kind of as Greek society grows up, so does its ideal sculptures grow up. And you can see that these guys are also not only older, but they're way stronger and buff and swole and whatever words you're using these days to describe people who work out a lot. And once again, the Greeks were all about self-improvement. And this sort of reached this incredible ideal where we see these just incredibly, almost like superhuman, muscular kinds of bodies that were became sort of the Greek ideal in the classical era. But you'll also notice that the faces are a lot more thoughtful. It's not just sort of like this blank expression of Critios boy here. But what we see in the Riace Warriors is thoughtfulness, is a strong mind in a strong body, or as the old saying goes, a sound mind in a sound body. because the Greeks believed not only did you need to improve yourself physically, but mentally. This was the society of the great mathematicians like Pythagoras and the great philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, of course. So self-improvement is mind and body, and then you improve yourself morally and ethically. As you can see, these sculptures are in incredibly good shape. The warrior A still has the inlaid, I believe this is seashell in his eye, and even has teeth. And you can see that his lips have a patina, what's called a patina. Patina is when you stain the metal. The image on the right doesn't have those things, but otherwise he's still he's intact. The only thing these guys are missing, being warriors, are their weapons. They would have been holding a shield in one hand, and they would have been holding either a spear or a sword in the other. Those were made out of wood or possibly iron, and those wood rots and iron rusts, so those have not lasted, but the bronze has been preserved. And these bronzes have given us an incredibly keen insight into the classical sculpture of ancient Greece. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention is you'll notice that Contrapposto has become really exaggerated. So as Greek classical sculpture sort of changed over time, it became more idealized, it became more stylized. Whereas Critios boy looks like a real dude, like a guy who's really in shape, maybe a young athlete, but a man nonetheless, I mean a guy in good shape nonetheless. But these guys are almost impossibly fit. They are not realistic in the sense that this is something that is easily achievable, but instead they are more an ideal, right? So how do you make bronze sculptures? You use a technique called the lost wax technique, and this will be in your notes to print out. I'm not going to go over this here in this video because there's going to be another video in this module that contains a much better description of this process. So I'm going to leave it to that video. So we're going to move on. And we're going to take a look at, some more bronzes. I almost forgot. You can see there are a few that survived. But for the most part, there are very few of these because they had been melted down over time. Now, this is a sculpture by the Greek artist Myron. It's called the Discobolos, the discus thrower, and you already know from our discussion of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, the importance of the Olympic Games is not only a proof of your athletic fitness, but also of your moral fitness. And this is a very kind of typical sculpture, very famous sculpture of an athlete. Now, something I want you to notice here, this is a Roman marble copy. So the Romans often made copies of classical Greek sculpture. The Romans were obsessed with the Greeks, and this is something we'll talk about extensively when we get to the next chapter on Rome. And they learned from Greek sculptures. However, Romans preferred, mostly they preferred to sculpt with marble as opposed to bronze. Sometimes that marble was painted, sometimes it wasn't, but they did prefer the marble over the bronze. And this means, though, that when they made copies of Greek sculptures, so like this is a Roman copy of a Greek sculpture, the original sculpture by Myron would have been made in bronze, but the Romans made it in marble. And you can always tell, not just because it's made in marble, but oftentimes the Romans would put these sort of supports, these buttresses, these little, whatever they were, random objects to help support the statue, because a bronze statue would be able to be self-supporting in this position of a discus thrower competing in an Olympic game. But this guy just happens to be sort of randomly halfway sitting on a tree trunk Why? Because if that wasn't there, he would fall over, because this is made of bronze. Because this is made of marble, I'm sorry. Marble is really fragile. It breaks really easily. This is one of the reasons why sculptors like it, because if you carve it the right way, the pieces of marble break off relatively easily. But also, if you hit it the wrong way, it shatters like glass. If you've ever dropped a piece of marble tile, it shatters like glass. But here we have, you know, this marble sculpture needs to be propped up. Otherwise, it will break, because it is very, very fragile stuff. Yet another reason why the Greeks preferred bronze, because it's way more durable than marble. That's why there's so many marble sculptures with missing and broken parts, because marble just is very easy to break. Here's another Roman copy of a Greek original, and this is an incredibly important sculpture. This is as important sort of to the high classical as the Critias boy is to the early classical. This is by the artist Polykleitos, and this is called the spear bearer or the spear thrower, or if you want to use the Greek word, the doryphorus. But you can call it the spear bearer or the spear thrower. I don't care. Technically, he's holding a spear, so he's bearing. He's bearing the spear, not throwing it. But sometimes you'll hear this called the spear thrower. So right off the bat, you should be able to recognize it as a classical sculpture. Why? Contrapposto. It's realistic. The guy, though, is super fit and super in shape. You know, basically, if you want to think of Greek classical sculpture, it's usually really buff, good-looking naked guys standing around looking incredibly thoughtful. Right? That's the thing. That's the shtick. That's the shtick, right? But this sculpture, known as Doryphorus or the spear bearer, actually has another name. Has an original name, which is the canon. So what is a canon? A canon is a list of rules or standards, right? You probably have heard this term online a lot, especially if you're a part of any sort of fandom, you know, whatever it is. Let's say Star Wars or something, and you'll often hear the term, you know, well, that book isn't canon, or that story isn't canon, meaning that it's not an official part of the story, right? It doesn't make up sort of the rules of the story that is being told. It's not part of what is the regular story, right? It is. And so that's what a canon really is. It is a set of rules or standards to guide whoever, an artist, or to guide whatever it is. And so this was designed by Polykleitos to be a standard of proportions, to be the canon of proportions. And also the canon of how a human body should be portrayed. This was meant to be the template. So we have a man who is in his sort of early middle age as opposed to a young boy in the early classical. So early classical tends to be young. Later classical tends to be older men because they are mature, more wise, more worldly, more intelligent than younger men. And we start to see more and more of an emphasis on intelligence as much as physical strength and beauty as we get deeper into the classical period. You'll also notice that he is standing in this contrapposto position once again. And for Polykleitos, the contrapposto was harmonious because it divided the body into four sort of equal portions. You know, if you can think of almost like north, south, east, west, the cardinal directions or whatever, for these four sort of perfect proportions. Also, you'll notice that half the body is at rest and half the body is activated. Once again, this was a way of showing the harmony of the body, of sort of what the body can do. It can rest and it can be in motion. So why all this obsession with kind of perfection and harmony and all this? Because the Greeks were obsessed with perfect ratios. I think we talked about this earlier, but if I didn't, here it goes. The Greeks used a ratio called the golden mean, or the golden ratio, you'll hear it called. It is the ratio down here of 1 by 1.618. It is represented by this rectangle whose one side is 1.618 and the other side is 1, right? It's a ratio. But they believe this ratio, which can be found all throughout nature, was a sort of divine ratio. It represented perfection. And the Greeks, who were always striving for perfection, utilized this ratio in their art and in their architecture because they wanted to kind of create this, sort of perfect body. Let's talk about the Persian Wars. The Persian Empire was massive. It was an empire that stretched through almost, a huge chunk of Asia, through the Middle East, into Egypt. And the Persians, as we know from our study of Persepolis, were this multicultural society with many languages, many religions, and they wanted to annex Greece. You can see why. If you annex Greece, then you open up the entire Mediterranean and even into Europe. And so strategically, in terms of trade, in terms of war, yeah, you want this. Okay. Well, the Greeks don't want to be part of the Persian Empire. And it wasn't uncommon for people to want to be included into the Persian Empire because large empires could offer you things like military protection, expanded trade, stable economies. And so, it wasn't uncommon for some people for some cultures simply to want to be incorporated into the Persian Empire, but not the Greeks, because the Greeks saw themselves as separate, as different, and they wanted to preserve their culture, they wanted to preserve their way. Plus, they were better than everybody. So, we are not going to be part of the Persian Empire. So in 492, Darius of Persia invades Greece. In 490, in the Battle of Marathon, the combined Greek city-states defeat the Persian Empire and send them back. 10 years later, Darius' son Xerxes invades Greece again. In 480, the Battle of Thermopylae occurs, where 300 Spartans hold back the Persians. And then in the Battle of Salamis, the city of Athens, the Athenian navy, they send their navy and sort of surround the Persians, and the Persians are defeated. Not immediately, there's a few other scuffles afterwards, but this is really sort of the nail in the coffin. You can imagine how the Athenians felt after this victory, because in many ways it was proof, and the Greek city-states in their entirety, but really especially Athens, it was proof of Greek superiority. It was proof of Greek morality. It was proof of Greek perfection. And so we call this era, after the defeat of the Persian Empire, the classical era, where sort of Greece, and especially Athens, but Greece reaches this sort of cultural zenith, this cultural height. Zenith is a Greek word, by the way. Reaches this sort of height, and because of their victory, the Greek expand their control of the Aegean and Mediterranean area. The Greek city-states sort of nope, that's not true. But this is a great time of wealth and prosperity for the Greek city-states. Pericles is the elected ruler of Athens. He was the general of Athens. He was instrumental in rebuilding and beautifying Athens after the Persian Wars. And he sets forth to sort of, physically manifest this concept that Greece, and especially Athens, is great. And, they want to show the world that, look, you can come invade us, you can knock us down, but we will sort of come back more powerful and stronger than before. And that's what they're seeking out to prove here. notice Pericles' sort of ideal, perfect appearance in this sculpture. But also, the Greeks formed something called the Delian League, and named after the Greek city-state of Delos, where this league would convene. And Pericles probably took money from this league to invest in the reconstruction of Athens. So that Greek morality looks great on paper, but not necessarily great in practice. Welcome to politics, my friends. This is the Acropolis. This is the high holy place located in the center of Athens, and it was the location of the temple built for the goddess Athena. This temple was destroyed during the Persian Wars. The Greeks swore, "We will never rebuild," as sort of a memorial to those who gave their lives. We are not going to rebuild. Eventually, the Greeks and the Persians form a truce and sign a treaty and become friends. And so after that, the Greeks aren't so much kind of hell-bent on this idea of, yeah, we're never going to rebuild. They absolutely do rebuild. In fact, Pericles wants to show the world that we are stronger and more powerful than we were before. Like Obi-Wan Kenobi said to Darth Vader in Star Wars, "Strike me down and I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine." That's what the Greeks want to do. And so they rebuild the Acropolis complex. Acropolis means high place. A lot of Greek cities are built around mountains, or an acropolis, a hill, I should say, and they have their temples on here. This isn't just, though, to signify the holiness and to be closer to the gods or the goddesses, but there's practical concerns for this, too. This is also the location of the treasury of Athens, and so a high place is easier to protect. And we'll talk more about that here in a little bit. Okay. So the Acropolis, and this is what it looked like back in the days of Pericles. The Acropolis consisted of several buildings here, mostly temples. But this formed the center of a large festival called the Panathenaic. Panathenaic, the Panathenaic Festival, which was a festival dedicated to Athena. There was a long sort of parade, a ceremonial kind of gathering that happened in the marketplace of Athens. And throughout the day, this parade would sort of wind its way through the streets. Then this large group of people would ascend the stairway up to the Acropolis. Then there would have been a large ceremony outside here, next to this building called the Parthenon, which we will talk about a lot in just a moment. There would have been a sacrifice to a bull. There would have been some other ceremonial events happening, all sort of in celebration of Athens. And all celebration of Athena. But this is also the Athenians celebrating themselves, because after this victory against the Persians, the Athenians are filled with a sense of civic pride. So this becomes very important, and we'll see how that plays out also here. There are several major buildings we're going to be looking at on the Acropolis. There is the Parthenon, which we see here. There is this gateway, the Propylaea. We're going to be looking at a building called the Erechtheion, and then we're going to be looking at the Temple of the Athena Nike. Not in that order. In fact, the first building we're going to look at is the Propylaea, which is the gateway. And so we've seen this before, this idea of a transitional space, a doorway, a gateway, a porch, whatever, some sort of work of architecture delineating the fact that, oh, I am moving from the sort of normal everyday world into the sacred realm. And so you pass through sort of a gateway, an opening into this sacred realm. This Propylaea was a little sort of mini complex of building. It was attached to an art gallery, actually. But the first building we're going to look at is this Temple of Athena Nike. Athena had several different sort of aspects. She could take sort of different kind of guises or roles. And one of her role was the role of victory. That's what Nike means. That's why your shoes are called Nikes, because when you wear them, you will be victorious in whatever sport you, are participating in. Okay. So this was designed by a guy named Menescles. It's the Propylaea. This is what you would walk through as you come into the Acropolis. On your right, there would be this little temple of Athena. If this was designed by an architect named Callicrates, whose name you will see over and over and over again, he designed several buildings up here on the Acropolis. This building had a little parapet. A parapet is a little wall around it because it's sort of right on the edge of the Acropolis, and so you don't want to fall off. But I love this image here. This is an image of Athena, or of a Nike, I should say. Nikes were warrior goddesses who soldiers would pray to in battle to help them be victorious. And so we see this image of this Nike adjusting her sandal. She is probably removing it because she is about to enter sacred ground. Because remember, this is right at the doorway, or sort of the entrance to the Acropolis. But also, if you look closely here, you can see something we call the Greek wet drapery technique. Especially in Athens, the sculptors had become very, very good at depicting the human body, as you saw in the last lesson. They had mastered the human form. But as you know, the Greeks didn't show the female figure nude. Only the male figure was shown nude. But they wanted to show off the body, and they wanted to show off their skills as artists. So they developed this wet drapery technique where you see these garments cling to the female form. I guess in sort of an early wet t-shirt content. No. But in sort of a way to show off the skill of the sculptor and to show off the human form. And so we see that wet drapery technique. And this is a key aspect of the classical era, is this wet drapery. This is the Acropolis. This is the main building this is the Parthenon. This is the main building on the Acropolis. It was built by a guy named Ichthyonos, and then there's Callicrates again. Although they didn't design the whole complex. The whole complex was sort of under the mastermind of this guy named Phidias, Phidias. We'll see his name in a second. But Phidias sort of came up with this entire layout, the decorative program of the Acropolis, and then individual architects would create these buildings. This is the Parthenon as it looks today. You will be going through a reading as part of this unit that will explain why this place looks like this now, why it looks like it blew up, because, hey, guess what? It did blow up. But this is what the Parthenon looked like back in the day. Once again, it's a painted sculpture. It has painted sculpture, just like all Greek temples would have. It is a peripteral building. It is surrounded by a colonnade of Doric columns. You'll notice that one of the differences between between archaic and classical architecture are the proportions. The proportions become much longer and leaner and thinner in this time period. And in fact, The proportions were very important to the Greeks because the Greeks believed that certain proportions reflected perfection. And this is all built on a proportion called the golden mean or the golden ratio. So what is the golden ratio, or sometimes known as the golden section, or the golden mean, or the golden rectangle, or the golden gram? No, it's not golden grams. It is a relationship between two sides of a rectangle. It's 1 by 1.618, but it was considered to be ideal. This golden section can be found in nature. It's found in the human body. It's found in the relationships of petals of flowers. It's sort of everywhere. And the Greeks, being great mathematicians, being sort of the founding fathers of geometry, were obsessed with ratios and proportions because we know why, right? Because it was related to the concept of perfection and morality and all that stuff. Okay, so it's basically this specific rectangle nested within itself. And if you trace the corners of the rectangle, it forms a spiral. And so both the rectangle itself and the spiral were used all throughout Greek art. It is based on a mathematical sequence called the Fibonacci sequence, where it's basically every number is the sum of the two previous numbers. So 1 and 1 is 2, 2 and 1 is 3, 3 and 2 is 5. And so it's basically the physical manifestation of that mathematical formula. But for the Greeks, it equaled perfection. And so we can see this all over the Parthenon, okay? Like all Greek temples, this peripteral temple was covered with sculpture and painted. They're like the temple of Zeus at Olympia. The images along the sides of the temple told a story that not only celebrated the god, or in this case the goddess, but also related to how the Greeks saw themselves. There is a moral story, in this case and a historical story that is being told. So first of all, though, let's look at the East Pediment. So here, which depicts the birth of Athena. And so here we see not her actual birth. In fact, she was born by coming out of the head of Zeus. She was the ultimate headache. But here she is being sort of presented to the other gods of Olympus. So this warrior goddess, this goddess of wisdom, who literally came from the mind of the head god, here is being sort of rewarded. This laurel wreath, this symbol of her victory, of her power, as she's presented to the gods. So that's appropriate. This is the Temple of Athena. Here's her origin story. Here is an image of the god Helios. These are now in London. In your reading, you will learn about what happened to the sculptures from the Parthenon. I'm not going to get into it in this lecture because you are going to have a major assignment this unit that deals specifically with that. But here we see with Helios that sort of buff, perfect Greek nude male body that you should have recognized by now. What I love are these horses, because Helios is the sun god, and he carried the sun in a chariot, and he would ride around the world. And so we're not getting the full horses, but instead we see the horses emerging from the base of the pediment in the same way the sun emerges from the horizon every morning. I think that's a really sort of genius use of the horses here. On the west side, so this is the original east side, west side dispute. No, it's not. On the west side, in the west pediment, we see a contest between Athena and Poseidon. So it was the two gods quarreled, as Greek gods often did, about who is going to be honored with being the patron of the city of Athens. It wasn't named Athens at that point, and the two of them decided, all right, whoever presents Athens with the best gift will be the patron god. And so Poseidon says, all right, I got this. I'm the god of the sea. And he takes his trident and bam, he smashes it against the water and smashes it against the ground, and seawater starts come bubbling up. And this is great because Athens is a seaport. Later on, they become this great naval presence. So yes, this is their seafaring side. This is also their war side because this alludes to their great sort of naval victories. But over here, here's Athena, and she's like, no. No, I got a better idea. Takes her staff, bam, slams it into the ground, and an olive tree emerges. And so the Athenians choose, well, we're going to go with the olive tree because the olives become sort of the great export of Athens. It becomes sort of the base of their economy, and Athena, by giving them this gift, a gift of peace, a gift of commerce, appeals to their more moral, ethical side. So this is a nation that is willing to fight if it needs to fight, as it did against the Persians and won a naval victory. But it is also a culture known for its reason and its culture and its literature and its plays and its music. And Athena, this goddess of wisdom, is how they wanted to represent themselves. But see how this story kind of also ties into the Athenians' victory over the Persians. They just didn't win because they were mightier. They won because they were moral. Speaking of the Persians, all around the Parthenon are images of battles. Now, we've seen this over and over and over in Greek temples and the Greek treasuries, and these battles are always metaphors. They're always allegories for something else. And all of these battles depict horrific monsters, creatures, titans, centaurs, giants, fighting gods. This was meant to represent the Athenian victory over the Persians. And so they saw themselves as the gods, and they saw the Persians as monsters. Once again, this sort of Athenian notion and Greek notion that they're somehow better than everybody else, that they are the measure of all men. This is an image of three goddesses. Maybe it's who it is, says down here, Hestia, Diana, and Aphrodite, but we don't ultimately know. These Parthenon marbles, as you will read, are in pretty poor shape. But we still get a really good idea here of what they look like, and boy, oh boy, look at that Greek wet drapery technique. It is everywhere, and that female form is really trying to sort of come out from under this garment. We will see eventually the Greeks will throw that garment away completely, and the female statues will become as nude as the male statues, but we're still a few decades away from that as of yet. It is not only images of gods that are found on the Temple of Athena. Let's go back to our image here. Along the sides of the temple, so behind the colonnade, the Athenians have created an image we call the Panathenaic procession. It is a frieze, so it is a band of relief sculpture that depicts, and these would have all been painted, of course, the members of the city of Athens participating in the Panathenaic festival. And so the citizens, the real life citizens, as they participated in this festival and walked up to the Acropolis and walked up to the Parthenon, they would have seen themselves on the side of the building. You can see here is an image on the right of three gods sort of sitting back and looking on the humans. They're not intervening, they're participating. In a way, it's almost like the gods have taken a back seat, because the citizens of Athens saw themselves as special. I mean, think about this, guys. They have put themselves on the level of the gods. They have elevated themselves and slapped themselves on the side of a temple. What do you think that tells you about how they viewed themselves? Yeah, they were pretty darn high on that horse, weren't they? We see in this image here an image of a cloth being folded. There was a woman from Athens who was selected to carry or wear, it's not really unknown, the sacred garment that was associated with Athena as this procession, as this band of people, as I told you about, this big parade sort of marched through the city and then wound its way up onto the Acropolis. There would be this big ceremony with the slaughtering of a bull, and all this other stuff sort of on the Acropolis itself, and this ancient statue of Athena was taken out, and it was dressed in this garment. So that is what we're seeing here. But look, you can get an image, idea in this reconstruction of what this would have looked like with this painted image. If you look up at the top, we see what is known as this Greek meander, this maze-like sort of pattern, which we have seen, well, since the Aegean. So this is a holdover from the pre-Greek or pre-Hellenic culture. And here's another very kind of terrible image, but you get an idea. Inside the temple was a massive 40-foot tall statue of Athena, designed by Phidias, designed by the guy who came up with basically an entire plan of the Parthenon. The image on the right is from a reconstruction in Nashville, Tennessee. There is a entire reconstruction of the Parthenon in Nashville, and you can go and you can rent it for weddings or whatever you want to, and there is a reconstruction of the goddess Athena. You see in her hand she is holding a Nike. Nikes were associated with Athena. They were symbols of victory. She is a warrior goddess. You can see her with her spear and her shield. She is wearing this garment made of gold. This was eventually, the statue was destroyed, the gold was stolen. In the next century, Greece loses its power. It loses its hold on itself because it falls into civil war. And during this civil war, the statue is stolen and the golden garments are taken. But remember, this entire building is a treasury. It is not only a temple, but it is meant to hold the wealth of Athens and these sacred objects. So imagine what this would look like, because you can't see the statue of Athena, you can't walk in here. Like a lot of ancient societies, the temples were reserved for the priest. So imagine what that would look like as you walked up to the Parthenon and you stared through these columns and you looked into the building itself. Athena would be in here. And remember, the Greeks believed that their gods inhabited the sculptures inside the temples. So you weren't just looking at a statue of Athena, you were looking at Athena. And imagine how she would look through these wooden slats here in front of the opening into the cella or the naos. As you look inside, imagine this sort of golden shimmering vision of Athena reflecting by torchlight with this sort of reflecting pool in front of her, creating this otherworldly effect. Because in your mind as an ancient Athenian, you are staring at your goddess. And so Phidias went to great lengths to create this sort of otherworldly sort of appearance of this goddess. Another building, an important building on the Acropolis, is a building called the Erechtheion. And here it is. It is not a Doric building like the Parthenon is, but and actually the Doric contains both, the Parthenon contains both Doric and Ionic columns. The Erechtheion contains only Ionic columns. It is an oddly shaped building because it was built around the old Temple of Athena. They wanted to preserve the base for that. So that would have been it right down here. It was also built around several objects, an olive tree, some graves. It's also on the side of the cliff of the Acropolis, so it had to be designed. It has this sort of weird shape. It's unlike really any other Greek temple. And this is where that sacred statue of Athena would have been kept. An olive tree was planted here because this is thought to be the site where that competition between Poseidon and Athena happened. So in fact, both Poseidon's trident mark, where he takes his three-pronged fork, and where Athena's olive tree both exist here. There are caryatids, which are basically chora figures that are used as columns. We have seen these back with the Siphnian treasury at Delphi, and here we see it. These were very elaborate. They were probably covered in gold, encrusted with gems. This, in many ways, is the most sacred spot of the Acropolis because of its relationship to the goddess Athena and the story of Poseidon, and so it was treated in many ways because it covers a holy site. And so that's the Acropolis. The Acropolis is this massive complex that served as a temple. It served as a treasury, as a holy site, as sort of the center of Athens, both geographically and sort of spiritually. And it is the most important site that we will be studying from ancient Greece. But more than anything, it is the Athenians celebrating themselves is what this represents. This sort of golden age of Greece. This culture that invented democracy, this culture that championed the individual, this culture that championed the human. This is as much of a celebration of the Athenians themselves as it is a sacred place dedicated to their goddess. Now, don't get me wrong, it is that. It is very much that. But it is also this other thing. That's the Acropolis. We are now going to look at some Greek painting. We've seen Greek painting on sculpture, of course, because we know that Greek sculpture was painted, but we haven't seen a lot of Greek painting outside of painting on vases, and that's because there's not much that exists. Greeks preferred to paint on large wooden panels. These mostly have not survived. In fact, none of them have really survived. There are a few cases of paintings on walls, of frescoes, of mural paintings, but those are rare. Mostly it was wooden panels, and those haven't survived. So we have to kind of extrapolate what we see in the paintings on vases, and sort of put together what their wall paintings look like. We do, and their panel paintings look like. We do have descriptions, but once again, it's hard to know. Something that happened in the classical period was a third kind of vase painting was invented. We've already looked at the black figure and the red figure, but which were both archaic inventions. But now we're looking at something called the white ground, and this was made by using a white clay slip. There's that word again. Slip is a watered down clay that is used as a kind of a glaze on the surface of the pots. This gave artists a lot more freedom in applying other colors, although the colors that you see here in this particular vase painting, the yellow, for example, in the woman's garment, would not have been, this is not part of the firing process. That would have been added later, so it's not permanently adhered to the surface of the pot like a lot of the other colors that you see are. So, these were very delicate. And typically the white ground, with a few exceptions, was mostly used for a kind of pot called a lekithos. Lekithos is used almost exclusively, or was used almost exclusively for funerals. Special oils, those kinds of things were kept in here, and they were made for offerings for the dead. In this image, we see a picture of a woman sitting in her chair, sitting in the klezmos chair that we saw in the Hegesso stele, which is a chair often associated with the motherly role of the wife in Greek art and in Greek culture. It is this sort of curved legged chair that you see over and over and over again, which is meant to sort of represent the heart of the family, the sort of seat of the family, if you will, which is the mom or the mother, the wife. And in this image we see a soldier leaving for battle. You see that he is handing over his helmet to his wife. This is probably a symbol of his upcoming death. He's leaving something behind for her, because we know that he doesn't make it back from war, that he dies in battle. And there is a sort of a sense of sorrow, a stillness to this painting that I find incredibly moving in a way. There's a quietness here, as if they both know what is about to happen, and yet they can't change the fate and this oncoming death. You'll notice that something that else has changed is in the profile. We are finally away from that composite figure. So if you look at the eye, we no longer have that eye sort of sitting on the side of the head, Egyptian style anymore. But we see the artist attempt to create an eye as it appears from the side. So this goes along with every sort of innovation that we have seen in Greek classical innovations in Greek classical sculpture, this move to more realism and naturalism, and we're seeing it here in the paintings also. This white ground technique, as I said earlier, allowed for the addition of color. Even though these colors could be very delicate and could come off easily, it allowed for these colors to show up. But it also allowed for more background details. And so if you look back here behind the woman, you can see there are objects hanging on the wall of their house. So it adds yet another layer of realism that wasn't there before. Here's another example of a lekithos. This is another image of related to the death of a warrior. Here he is seated at his own tomb, but here you can see even more of those background details. The chair behind him, the tomb behind him, that the white ground technique allowed to happen. The last image I want to look at is a red figure vase. Once again, though, even though this is an older technique, the red figure technique, which dates back to the archaic, if you look at the faces, you can see those profiles with the side view eye. But you'll notice something here in this work that is, I think, incredibly innovative. Traditionally in Greek painting, everybody is sort of standing on the same, everybody is sort of standing on the same line. And I could show you image after image of this. There's this one ground line and everybody kind of lines up on it. There was a panel painter, a guy named Polygnotos, who came up with this technique of putting his characters standing in different levels, so they're not all just standing on one ground line. So if you see in this image here, which is an image of a massacre, basically, Apollo and Artemis, these two gods, are slaughtering these children. Look it up. It's a very interesting myth. We're not going to get into it here, but we see this scene of slaughter, but you see the bodies lying in the foreground and the background. You'll notice that there's some weirdness with the scale. that the figures in the foreground appear smaller than the figures in the background. The Greeks were still figuring it out. This was all a brand new technique, so creating a realistic depth was still very difficult to do, and learning the tricks that artists have learned over the years to make a convincing image of space with figures in the foreground and figures in the background was hard to do, and those techniques had not yet been learned yet. But we're still seeing a great advancement in the way space is conveyed in a painting.